The flames had long died out, but the smoke still lingered in Sarah Linden's throat as she stood amid the charred remains of what had once been her home. The year was 1876, and life in Linden, Colorado territory wasn't meant to be easy, but it wasn't meant to be this cruel either. Her calloused fingers clutched a locket, the only possession she'd managed to save from the fire that had devoured everything else. The cabin had stood for nearly 3 years, built by her late husband Jonathan before typhoid fever claimed him last winter. Now, as the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the blackened timbers, Sarah wondered if fate was telling her to move on, to abandon this patch of earth that seemed determined to break her spirit. She hadn't cried when the flames engulfed her home 2 days prior. She hadn't cried when she'd spent the last 2 nights sleeping under the stars with only her mare Penny for company. Sarah had learned long ago that tares wouldn't rebuild fences or plant crops or keep the wolves at bay, both the 4-legged kind and the 2-legged variety that occasionally drifted through town. The distant sound of hoofbeats pulled her from her thoughts. Her hand instinctively moved to the small revolver tucked in the pocket of her skirt. Living alone had taught her caution. As the rider came into view, she recognized the lean figure of Samuel Zane, his chestnut gelding kicking up dust as they approached. Samuel was one of the few decent cowboys who worked at the Double Cross Ranch about 5 miles north. He'd helped Jonathan with the barn raising before he fell ill, and occasionally stopped by to check on Sarah in the months following her husband's death, never staying long enough to cause gossip in town, but long enough to split firewood or mend a fence. "Miss Sarah," he called out, slowing his horse to a walk as he neared. His voice carried the gentle drawl of someone born farther south, though he rarely spoke of where he'd come from before Colorado. "Mr. Zane," she acknowledged, her hand falling away from her pocket. He dismounted with the easy grace of a man who spent most of his life in the saddle, his weathered hat pulled low over eyes the color of summer cornflowers. At 30, he was only a few years older than Sarah, though the sun and wind had etched fine lines around his eyes. Samuel surveyed the ruins of the cabin, his expression grim beneath his sun-browned skin. "Heard about the fire in town, came as soon as I could get away." He removed his hat, revealing dark blonde hair in need of a trim. "Was it?" He left the question hanging, though they both knew what he was asking. "Lightning strike," Sarah replied, her voice steady. "During that storm 2 nights back, I was in the barn checking on a sick calf by the time I noticed." She gestured at the devastation before them. Samuel nodded, his jaw tight with unspoken sympathy. "You hurt. Just some singed hair and a burn on my arm trying to save what I could." She didn't mention the photographs of her parents, the family Bible, the hand-carved rocking chair that Jonathan had made for their future children, all gone now. "Where have you been staying?" "Here." She gestured to a small lean-to she'd hastily constructed against the stone chimney, the only part of the cabin still standing. "I'm not abandoning my land." Samuel's eyes swept over her makeshift shelter, then back to her face. His expression softened with something that wasn't quite pity. Sarah would have resented pity, but understanding. "You're planning to rebuild?" he asked, though it wasn't really a question. Sarah lifted her chin. "I have to. There's nowhere else for me to go." Something shifted in Samuel's expression then, a resolve that straightened his shoulders. He placed his hat back on his head, adjusting it with practiced ease. "We'll build it again together," he said simply. 5 simple words that Sarah hadn't expected, hadn't dared hope for. She'd been prepared to do it alone, to somehow find the strength to rebuild from ashes, just as she'd found the strength to continue after Jonathan's death. But the thought of not having to face this challenge alone made her throat tighten unexpectedly. "I can't ask that of you, Mr. Zane. You've got your own work. You didn't ask, I offered." A hint of a smile softened his features. "And after all this time, I reckon you might call me Samuel." Sarah hesitated. Accepting help meant acknowledging she couldn't do everything alone, something she'd been determined to prove since Jonathan's passing. But standing amidst the ruins of her home, with winter only a few months away, pride seemed a luxury she couldn't afford. "I can pay you," she said finally. Not much, but something when the crops come in. Samuel shook his head. I don't want your money, Miss Sarah. He glanced at the sky, gauging the time. I've got 3 days before I need to be back at the ranch. Let's see what we can accomplish. Without waiting for a response, he turned and began to unsaddle his horse. Sarah watched him, this man who'd ridden 5 miles to offer help without being asked, and felt a strange warmth bloom in her chest, the first such feeling since the fire had taken everything. Thank you, she said quietly, Samuel. He glanced up, his hands pausing on the saddle straps, and for a moment their eyes met across the charred remnants of her former life. Something unspoken passed between them, an understanding, perhaps, or a promise. We'll start with clearing away the debris, he said, turning back to his task. Then we'll see what can be salvaged. As the sun began its descent behind the distant mountains, Sarah realized that while the fire had taken her home, it might have given her something unexpected in return. A second chance. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of crisp autumn day that made the aspens shimmer gold against the blue Colorado sky. Sarah had offered Samuel the lean-to for the night while she slept in the barn, but he had refused, insisting on making his own simple camp beneath the stars. She'd found him at first light, already awake and boiling coffee over a small fire. Hope you don't mind, he said, gesturing to the pot. Brought my own supplies. I appreciate the thought, Sarah replied, accepting the tin cup he offered. The coffee was strong and bitter, nothing like the weaker brew she usually made to stretch her supplies, but it warmed her from the inside out. They worked methodically through the morning, sorting through the rubble, separating what could be salvaged from what was beyond saving. It was heartbreaking work. Each charred remnant of her previous life, a blackened spoon, the metal frame of her bed, a surprisingly intact ceramic pitcher brought memories flooding back. Jonathan made this, she said softly, holding up the twisted remains of an iron candle holder. He wasn't much of a blacksmith, but he was determined to learn. Samuel paused in his work, wiping sweat from his brow with a bandana. He seemed like a good man, your husband. He was. Sarah set the candle holder aside carefully. Not perfect, but good. He had dreams for this place. Samuel nodded, his eyes scanning the property, the small orchard Jonathan had planted, the fenced garden plot where Sarah still grew vegetables, the stream that ran along the eastern boundary. It's good land. It's everything I have, Sarah replied simply. By midday, they had cleared enough of the debris to see the original foundation of the cabin. Samuel stood with his hands on his hips, assessing the damage. Foundation's still solid, he noted. That's something, and the chimney's intact. He glanced at Sarah. How big was it before? 2 rooms. A main room with the kitchen and living area and a small bedroom. She hesitated. Jonathan had plans to add more when we had children. Samuel nodded, his expression thoughtful. We could do that same layout, maybe a bit bigger if the lumber stretches far enough. He pulled a small notebook from his pocket and began sketching. I've helped build enough bunkhouses and barns to know the basics. Sarah watched as his pencil moved across the paper, outlining what would become her new home. I have some savings, she said, for lumber and supplies. Not much, but enough to start. Olson at the Mercantile gives good rates if you can haul it yourself, Samuel said, still sketching. And Ben Harris over at the sawmill owes me a favor. Might be able to get some cut lumber at a discount. They spent the afternoon making a list of needed supplies. As the sun began to set, Sarah realized they had accomplished more in one day than she could have done alone in a week. The weight on her shoulders felt slightly lighter. As they sat by the fire that evening, eating a simple meal of beans and salt pork that Samuel had brought, Sarah found herself studying him in the flickering light. She'd known him only as Jonathan's occasional helper, and then as a somewhat distant friend who checked in on her after her husband's death. But this was different, seeing him work alongside her all day, watching how his mind worked as he planned the rebuild, noticing the quiet competence in his calloused hands. Why are you doing this? She asked suddenly. Samuel looked up, surprised by the question. Doing what? This. She gestured to the cleared foundation, the neatly stacked salvageable materials, the sketches they'd made. Taking time away from your own work to help me." He was silent for a moment, poking at the fire with a stick. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said finally. "There are plenty of right things to do in this world, Mr. Samuel. Most people don't go out of their way to do them." A small smile played at the corner of his mouth. "Maybe I'm not most people." Sarah waited, sensing there was more. After a long moment, Samuel sighed. "I lost my home once," he said quietly, his eyes on the fire. "Back in Texas after the war, farm burned to the ground while I was away. My parents were already gone by then, so I was on my own." His voice grew distant, as though seeing something far away. "Neighbor helped me rebuild. Old man named Josiah, didn't have to, but he did. Always figured I'd pay that debt forward someday." Sarah nodded, understanding now. "And I'm your someday." Their eyes met across the fire, and something in his gaze made her heart beat a little faster. "Guess you are," he said softly. The next morning, they rode into Linden together to purchase supplies. Sarah hadn't been to town since before the fire, and she felt a flutter of apprehension as they approached the main street. Linden wasn't large, a single street with a general store, a saloon, a small hotel, the sheriff's office, and a handful of other businesses, but word traveled fast in small towns. As predicted, their arrival drew attention. Mrs. Patterson stepped out of the millinery shop as they passed, her curious gaze taking in the sight of Sarah riding alongside Samuel. The blacksmith paused in his work, hammer suspended mid-stroke. Even Sheriff Mills, standing outside his office, raised an eyebrow at the pair. "Folks are staring," Sarah murmured, uncomfortably aware of the tear in her skirt and the soot still embedded beneath her fingernails. "Let them," Samuel replied calmly. "You've got nothing to be ashamed of." They tied their horses outside Olson's general store. Before they could enter, Betty Morgan bustled out, her round face creased with concern. "Sarah Linden, we've been worried sick about you," she exclaimed, pulling Sarah into an unexpected embrace. "Tom rode out yesterday to check on you but said you weren't there." "I was probably clearing debris with Mr. Zane," Sarah explained, extracting herself from Betty's arms. Betty's gaze shifted to Samuel, taking his measure with the practiced eye of a woman who had raised 5 sons. "That's mighty kind of you, Mr. Zane." Samuel touched the brim of his hat. "Madam, we've taken up a collection," Betty continued, turning back to Sarah. "Not much, mind you, but enough to help you get back on your feet. Pastor Wilson suggested it during Sunday service." Sarah felt heat rise to her cheeks. "That's very kind, but I don't you dare refuse," Betty interrupted firmly. "Pride's a sin, Sarah Linden, and we've all needed help at one time or another." She pressed a small pouch into Sarah's hands. "Now, what supplies do you need? Tom said I could extend credit until spring if necessary." With Betty's assistance, they gathered the supplies they needed more efficiently than Sarah had anticipated. News of their project spread quickly, and by the time they were loading the wagon Tom Morgan had lent them, several townspeople had offered additional help. Ben Harris from the sawmill promised to deliver lumber the next day at a reduced price. Sheriff Mills volunteered his teenage sons to help with the heavy lifting over the weekend. Even Old Man Jenkins, known for his miserly ways, contributed a box of nails from his own supplies. "Didn't expect all this," Samuel said quietly as they prepared to leave town. Sarah shook her head, still processing the outpouring of support. "Neither did I." As they drove the loaded wagon back to her property, Sarah found herself reevaluating her place in the community. She'd kept to herself after Jonathan's death, convinced that independence meant handling everything alone. Now she realized that there was strength in accepting help when needed, a lesson Jonathan himself had tried to teach her. The lumber arrived the next morning as promised, along with Ben Harris himself and 2 of his workers. With the additional hands, they made significant progress, setting the corner posts and beginning to frame the walls. Samuel worked alongside the men, his quiet competence earning their respect as he directed the construction. Sarah worked just as hard, refusing to be relegated to merely providing food and water for the men. She helped nail boards, held beams in place, and learned the basics of framing a wall under Samuel's patient instruction. By the end of the day, the basic structure of the cabin was taking shape. As the workers departed, promising to return when they could, Sarah stood beside Samuel, surveying their progress. "It's going to be bigger than before," she observed, noting the expanded dimensions. "Hope that's all right," Samuel replied. "Figured while we're building, might as well plan for the future." The future. The word hung between them, laden with unspoken meaning. Sarah had stopped thinking about the future after Jonathan died, focused only on surviving each day. Now, standing beside this quiet, steadfast man who had stepped into her life when she needed help most, she allowed herself to consider possibilities she'd thought forever closed to her. "The future," she echoed softly. "Yes, I suppose we should." Samuel's 3 days stretched into 5, then a week. He rode to the Double Cross only once, returning with news that his boss had granted him leave to help with the cabin, provided he made up the work later. Sarah suspected there was more to the story, perhaps wages forfeited or promises made, but Samuel brushed off her questions. They settled into a rhythm, working from dawn until dusk each day. The structure rose steadily, walls taking shape, a new roof going on. The townspeople continued to help when they could, bringing food, lending tools, offering labor. But increasingly, it was just Sarah and Samuel, working side by side in a comfortable silence punctuated by occasional conversation. She learned more about him during those days than she had in the previous 2 years of nodding acquaintance. He'd fought for the Confederacy during the war, though he spoke of it reluctantly and with no pride. He drifted west afterward, working cattle drives in Texas before making his way to Colorado. He could play the harmonica, though poorly by his own admission. He preferred winter to summer, coffee to tea, and had once dreamed of being a doctor before the war changed everything. In turn, she found herself sharing pieces of her own history growing up in Missouri, meeting Jonathan when he delivered mail to her father's store. Their journey west in search of land they could call their own. She told him about her 3 miscarriages, something she'd never spoken of to anyone in Linden. The words came easier in the midst of physical labor, somehow as if the act of building something new made it possible to examine the ruins of the past. 2 weeks after they'd begun, the basic structure was complete. The cabin now stood sturdy and new, larger than before, with 2 proper bedrooms instead of 1, a spacious main room, and even a covered porch facing west toward the mountains. They'd salvaged the original stone hearth and chimney, and Samuel had crafted a mantel from a piece of pine he'd selected specifically for its grain. "It's beautiful," Sarah said, running her hand along the smooth wood. "I never expected." "It's not finished yet," Samuel cautioned. "Still need to chink between the logs, finish the interior walls, build furniture." "But it's standing," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. "It's real," Samuel's expression softened. "Yes, it is." That evening, as they sat by the fire outside the nearly completed cabin, Sarah made a decision. She went to the barn and returned with a bottle wrapped in cloth. "Jonathan's whiskey," she explained, unwrapping it. "He was saving it for a special occasion." She looked up at Samuel. "I think this qualifies." Samuel accepted the cup she poured him, raising it slightly. "To new beginnings." "To new beginnings," she echoed, taking a small sip that burned pleasantly down her throat. They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the flames dance. The night was clear, stars scattered like diamond dust across the velvet sky. In the distance, a coyote called, its haunting cry answered by another. "I'll need to return to the Double Cross soon," Samuel said finally. "Thompson's been more than fair, but the fall roundup starts next week." Sarah nodded, trying to ignore the hollow feeling his words created. "Of course, you've already done more than I had any right to expect." "I've been thinking," he continued, his gaze still on the fire. "This land of yours, it's good land, but it's a lot for one person to manage." "I've managed so far," she replied, a touch defensively. "You have," he agreed, "but that doesn't mean you should have to do it alone." Sarah's heart began to beat faster. "What are you suggesting, Mr. Zane?" A small smile touched his lips at her reversion to formality. "I'm suggesting a partnership, Miss Linden. I've saved most of my wages these past years. Not enough for my own spread, but enough to invest in expanding yours." He gestured toward the dark shapes of the fields beyond the firelight. Those western acres could support cattle. "The stream provides good water. Between your crops and a small herd, this place could thrive." Sarah stared at him, trying to process his words. "A business partnership?" Samuel met her gaze then, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "For now, if that's what you want." The unspoken alternative hung in the air between them, as tangible as the cabin they'd built together. "I loved my husband," she said softly. "I know that. It's been less than a year since he passed." Samuel nodded. "I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give, Sarah. Just a chance to help build something here. The rest." He shrugged. "The rest can wait." Sarah looked at the cabin, at the land that had been her home and her burden for the past 3 years. She thought about the lonely months after Jonathan's death, the crushing weight of trying to manage everything alone. And she thought about the past 2 weeks, the shared labor, the quiet conversations, the gradual realization that Samuel Zane had become important to her in ways she hadn't anticipated. "A partnership," she said slowly, "to start with." The smile that spread across his face warmed her more than the whiskey. "To start with," he agreed. Samuel returned to the Double Cross Ranch the next day, promising to come back when the roundup was finished. The cabin felt strangely empty without his presence, though Sarah kept busy with the remaining work, filling the chinks between logs with a mixture of clay and straw, hanging the door he'd crafted, arranging the few furnishings that had survived the fire or been donated by neighbors. Betty Morgan visited, bringing curtains she'd sewn from flour sacks dyed a cheerful blue. Her knowing glances made Sarah blush, but she didn't deny Betty's gentle probing about Samuel. "He's a good man," was all she would say. "Good men are rare enough these days," Betty replied sagely. "Don't let pride stand in the way of happiness, Sarah." In Samuel's absence, Sarah found herself making plans. She cleared space in the barn for cattle, repaired the fencing on the western part of her property, and pored over seed catalogs by lamplight, envisioning expanded crops for the spring planting. 2 weeks passed before Samuel returned, riding up one crisp November afternoon with a small herd of cattle, 10 cows and a bull, and his possessions packed in saddlebags. "Thompson let me take part of my wages in cattle," he explained as Sarah came out to meet him. "Said it was a better investment than cash." Sarah surveyed the animals. "They look healthy. They are good stock, should give us a decent start." He hesitated. "If the offer still stands." In answer, Sarah gestured to the cabin where smoke curled from the chimney and new curtains hung in the windows. "Your room's the one on the left. I put in a bed and a chest of drawers. Nothing fancy." The smile that lit his face was worth any gossip their arrangement might generate. Never much cared for fancy anyway. Winter settled over Linden with a series of heavy snowfalls that blanketed the land in white. Inside the cabin, Sarah and Samuel established a careful routine. He slept in the second bedroom, she in the main one. They shared meals and chores, discussed plans for the spring, and gradually learned the rhythm of living together without stepping on each other's toes. The townspeople raised eyebrows at their arrangement, but when Pastor Wilson paid a call ostensibly to check on the new cabin, but clearly to assess the propriety of their living situation, he left satisfied that all was above board. Samuel's reputation as a hardworking, God-fearing man helped quiet the worst of the gossip, as did Sarah's continued attendance at Sunday services. Still, there were moments when the boundaries they'd established seemed to blur, catching each other's eyes across the table during meals. The brush of hands when passing tools. Late evenings by the fire, talking of their pasts and their hopes while snow fell silently outside. One such evening in early December, Samuel spoke of Christmas, wondering aloud what small traditions they might observe. "Jonathan and I always cut a small pine to bring inside," Sarah said, memory warming her voice. "Decorated it with paper chains and dried berries, nothing elaborate. My mother used to make a special bread," Samuel offered, "braided with dried fruit inside, called it Christmas braid." "Do you know how to make it?" I watched her enough times. Might be able to manage something similar. Sarah smiled at the image of this tall, strong cowboy kneading dough with the same hands that could rope a calf or frame a wall. I'd like that. As Christmas approached, they prepared in small ways, Samuel cutting a pine tree that Sarah decorated. Sarah sewing a new shirt for Samuel from fabric she'd traded eggs for. Samuel disappearing mysteriously into town one afternoon and returning with a bundle he hid in his room. On Christmas Eve, they attended the service at the small church in town, joining in the carols and listening to Pastor Wilson's retelling of the Nativity. Afterward, they returned home through gently falling snow, the silence between them comfortable and warm despite the cold night air. Inside, the cabin glowed with lamplight and the warmth of the fire. The pine tree stood in the corner, festive despite its simple decorations. On the table sat Samuel's attempt at his mother's Christmas braid, slightly lopsided but fragrant with cinnamon and dried cherries. "I have something for you," Samuel said, bringing out a package wrapped in brown paper. Sarah fetched her gift as well, suddenly shy. "It's not much." They exchanged packages, and Sarah carefully unwrapped hers to find a beautiful leather-bound journal, its cover embossed with a simple design of leaves. "For your garden plans," Samuel explained, "and whatever else you might want to write." "It's perfect," she whispered, running her fingers over the soft leather. "Thank you." Samuel unwrapped his gift next, holding up the deep blue shirt with appreciation. "You made this?" Sarah nodded. "I noticed your old one was wearing through at the elbows." He rubbed the fabric between his fingers. "No one's made me clothing since my mother died. Thank you." Their eyes met across the small space between them, and something shifted in the air, a current of unspoken feeling that had been building since that first day beside the burned-out cabin. Samuel took a step closer, then hesitated. She closed the distance between them, her heart racing. Samuel, his hand came up to touch her cheek, calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "I don't want to rush you. You haven't," she whispered. "It's been nearly a year since Jonathan died, and these past months with you." She took a deep breath. "I wasn't looking for this for you, but here we are, he echoed, his voice rough with emotion. When his lips met hers, it felt both surprising and inevitable, like finding something precious she hadn't known she'd lost. His kiss was gentle at first, questioning, then deepening as she responded, her hands coming up to rest against his chest. When they finally broke apart, Samuel rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that since I saw you standing beside that burned-out cabin." "Why didn't you?" she asked, her voice teasing despite the emotion tightening her throat. "Didn't seem proper, what with you in the midst of disaster and all." His smile faded into seriousness. "I wanted to earn your trust first, show you that I meant to stay, not just help and leave." Sarah nodded, understanding. "You've more than proven that." She took his hand, lacing her fingers with his. "I think Jonathan would approve, you know. He always said I was too stubborn for my own good, trying to shoulder everything alone." Sounds like a wise man. He was. She looked around at the cabin they'd built together, so different from the one she'd shared with Jonathan, yet filled with the same sense of possibility. "But I'm learning that there's room in a heart for more than one love, different but no less real." Samuel's thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. "I'm not trying to replace him, Sarah. I know that, and you couldn't even if you tried." She met his gaze steadily. "Just as I couldn't replace what you lost in Texas, we carry those pieces with us, but we can build something new together." His smile was slow and warm, crinkling the corners of his eyes. "We're good at building things together." "Yes," she agreed, rising on her toes to kiss him again. "Yes, we are." Winter gave way to spring, the snow melting to reveal the promise of new growth beneath. The partnership that had begun with a burned cabin and a simple offer of help had blossomed into something deeper, stronger. They were married on a clear April day, with the mountains still capped in snow and wildflowers beginning to dot the meadows. Pastor Wilson performed the ceremony in the small church in Linden, with most of the town in attendance. Betty Morgan cried openly, while Samuel's boss Thompson served as best man, his weathered face unusually solemn for the occasion. Sarah wore a dress of pale blue that she'd sewn herself, with Betty's help for the more intricate details. Samuel wore a new suit purchased in Denver during a cattle selling trip, looking both handsome and slightly uncomfortable in the formal attire. Their vows were simple but heartfelt. Samuel promised to partner with Sarah in all things, to respect her independence while offering his strength. Sarah promised to share her dreams and burdens alike, to build a future that honored both their pasts. "By the power vested in me," Pastor Wilson concluded, his voice carrying through the small church, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." The kiss they shared was brief but tender, mindful of the audience but unabashed in its promise of deeper intimacies to come. The celebration afterward was held at their cabin, where tables had been set up in the yard, and food contributed by nearly every household in town created a feast unlike anything Linden had seen in years. There was dancing to fiddle music, children playing games, and enough good wishes to carry them through whatever challenges lay ahead. As the sun began to set, casting golden light across the land they now shared in name as well as deed, Samuel took Sarah's hand and led her away from the festivities to a quiet spot near the stream. "Happy?" he asked, his arm sliding around her waist. "Very," she replied, leaning into him. "Though I'll be happier still when all these people go home and I have you to myself." His laugh rumbled through his chest. "Never thought I'd hear Sarah Linden forgive me, Sarah Zane admit to wanting to be alone with a man." "Not just any man," she corrected, turning in his arms to face him. "My husband." The word felt right on her tongue, as natural as if she'd been saying it for years rather than hours. Samuel's expression softened, and he bent to kiss her with none of the restraint he'd shown in the church. "I have something for you," he said when they finally broke apart. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden box, intricately carved with a pattern of intertwining vines. "Made it myself." Sarah opened it carefully to find a simple gold band nestled inside. "Samuel, it was my mother's," he explained. "The one thing I managed to save from the fire in Texas. Seems fitting, somehow, that it should come to you now." With gentle fingers, he took the ring and slipped it onto her finger beside the plain band they'd exchanged during the ceremony. It was slightly loose, but the weight of it felt right, a connection to his past that now became part of their shared future. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "I'll treasure it always." They returned to the celebration hand in hand. But as the evening wore on, the guests gradually departed, leaving behind good wishes and enough leftover food to last them a week. When the last wagon had disappeared down the road, Samuel closed the door of their cabin and turned to his wife with a smile that made her heart race. "Alone at last," he said softly. What followed was a night of tender discovery. For Sarah, who had known only one man before, there was both familiarity and newness in their lovemaking. Samuel was patient and gentle, attuned to her responses in a way that spoke of his care for her pleasure as much as his own. When they finally lay tangled together in the darkness, her head resting on his chest and his fingers tracing patterns on her bare shoulder, Sarah felt a sense of completion she had feared might never be hers again. "I love you," Samuel murmured into her hair. "Have for a long while now." Sarah pressed a kiss to his chest, right above his heart. "And I love you, probably longer than I've been willing to admit, even to myself." His arms tightened around her. "We've got time to make up for that now, all the time in the world." Spring turned to summer, and the land they tended together flourished under their combined care. Sarah's gardens expanded, providing vegetables for their table and enough surplus to trade in town. The small herd of cattle grew with the birth of calves, pastured on the western acres that had once gone unused. They established a rhythm to their days, rising with the sun, sharing chores, working side by side when possible or dividing tasks when necessary. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch Samuel had built, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of purple and gold, talking of their day or simply enjoying the comfortable silence between them. It wasn't always easy. They argued occasionally, usually when Sarah's stubborn independence clashed with Samuel's protective instincts. But they learned to work through disagreements with the same patience they applied to building fences or training horses methodically, with respect for each other's perspective, and always with the relationship as the priority. In late summer, Sarah began to suspect what the intermittent nausea and unusual fatigue might mean. When her suspicions were confirmed, she waited for the right moment to share the news. It came on a warm August evening. They had just finished supper and were sitting on the porch steps, Samuel whittling a small piece of wood while Sarah mended a tear in one of his shirts. "What are you making?" she asked, nodding toward the wood taking shape in his hands. He turned it in the fading light. "Thought I might try my hand at a cradle, getting a head start." Sarah's hands stilled on her mending, her heart suddenly pounding. "A cradle?" Samuel glanced at her, a knowing smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Unless you think we won't be needing one. How did you know?" she whispered. He set aside the wood and took her hand in his. "You've been sick in the mornings for 2 weeks now. You pushed away coffee yesterday, you never turned down coffee, and there's a look about you." He touched her cheek gently, a glow. Tears filled Sarah's eyes, happy ones that spilled over when she blinked. "I was going to tell you tonight. I wasn't sure how you'd feel." Samuel's expression grew serious. "Sarah, this child, our child, is a blessing I never dared hope for." He placed his hand gently on her still flat stomach. "Are you afraid because of before?" She covered his hand with hers, understanding his reference to her previous miscarriages. "A little," she admitted, "but this feels different somehow, and I have you this time." He pulled her close, his arms strong and reassuring around her. "You do. For whatever comes." The pregnancy progressed well through the fall. Samuel took on more of the physical labor, insisting that Sarah rest when needed, though she continued to manage many of the daily chores despite his protective concerns. They prepared for the baby's arrival. Samuel finished the cradle, crafting it with the same care he'd shown in rebuilding their cabin, while Sarah sewed tiny garments from soft flannel. As winter approached, they discussed names during the long evenings by the fire. "If it's a boy, I'd like to name him after my father," Samuel said. "William Zane." Sarah tested the name on her tongue. "It has a good sound, and if it's a girl," Samuel considered. "What was your mother's name?" "Eleanor, though everyone called her Ellie." "Eleanor for a girl then," he decided, "or Ellie for short." Sarah smiled, imagining a small girl with Samuel's blue eyes and perhaps her own dark hair. "I'd like that." The baby arrived in late February, during a snowstorm that left drifts piled against the cabin walls and made travel impossible. It was Betty Morgan's daughter Rebecca, trained as a midwife, who had been staying with them for the final weeks of the pregnancy, who helped deliver the child. After hours of labor that left Sarah exhausted but triumphant, Samuel Zane held his son for the first time, a robust boy with a shock of dark hair and lungs powerful enough to announce his arrival to the world in no uncertain terms. "William Jonathan Zane," Sarah said softly as Samuel placed the swaddled infant in her arms. They had decided to honor both their fathers in the naming. "He's perfect," Samuel whispered, his voice rough with emotion as he sat on the edge of the bed, one arm around Sarah's shoulders, the other gently touching his son's tiny hand. "He is," Sarah agreed, marveling at the small face that somehow combined features from both of them. "Our miracle." As little William grew, the cabin that had risen from ashes became truly a home filled with the everyday sounds of family life, from a baby's cries and laughter to the murmured conversations of parents after their child was asleep. The cradle Samuel had carved sat beside their bed, though increasingly the baby spent more time exploring the cabin floor, crawling with determination toward whatever caught his interest. By the time William's first birthday approached, their small ranch had prospered beyond what either of them had initially hoped. The cattle herd had doubled in size, and Samuel's careful breeding program promised quality stock for the future. Sarah's gardens had expanded to include medicinal herbs that she sold to the apothecary in town, and her preserved fruits and vegetables had won prizes at the county fair. They celebrated William's birthday with a small gathering. The Morgans, Pastor Wilson and his wife, Thompson from the Double Cross, and a few other friends who had become like family. As they watched their son toddle unsteadily from person to person, charming everyone with his infectious laugh and curious nature, Samuel took Sarah's hand. "Did you ever imagine this?" he asked quietly. "That day when I found you beside the burned cabin." Sarah leaned against his shoulder, contentment warming her despite the February chill. "Never. I thought my life was ending, not beginning again. And now." She turned to face him, taking in the familiar features that had become so dear to her, the crinkles at the corners of his eyes, the strong line of his jaw, the steadiness in his gaze that had been her anchor through both joy and hardship. "Now I know that sometimes what looks like an ending is really just the start of something better than we could have imagined." She reached up to touch his face. "I wouldn't trade a moment of it, Samuel, not even the fire." "Nor would I," he replied, bending to kiss her softly. "Though I'd prefer not to test our rebuilding skills again anytime soon." Sarah laughed, the sound joining with their son's happy babbling to fill the cabin with the music of family, a symphony of love that had begun with 5 simple words spoken beside the charred remains of a previous life. "We'll build it again together." 5 years passed, seasons turning like pages in the story of their lives. The small ranch prospered under their combined efforts, gradually expanding as they purchased adjoining land that had been abandoned during a drought 2 years prior. What had begun as Sarah's modest homestead became the Zane Ranch, known throughout the county for quality cattle and the best produce at the summer market. William, now 6, had been joined by a sister Alina Rose, called Ellie, with her mother's dark eyes and her father's quiet determination. At 3, she already showed signs of Sarah's green thumb, following her mother through the gardens and solemnly helping to water the vegetables. The cabin had expanded as well, with Samuel adding rooms as their family grew. What had once been a 2-room dwelling was now a proper home with 4 bedrooms, a spacious kitchen, and the same welcoming front porch where they still sat most evenings, watching the sunset while the children played in the yard. On a warm June evening, as Sarah rocked 2-month-old James, their unexpected but joyfully welcomed 3rd child, she watched Samuel teaching William how to whittle a simple stick into a toy boat for the stream. Ellie sat nearby on a quilt, solemnly arranging pebbles in patterns that made sense only to her. "Careful with that knife, son," Samuel instructed, his hands guiding William's smaller ones. "Always cut away from yourself." William nodded, his face a study in concentration. "Like this, Pa." "That's right, you're getting the hang of it." Sarah smiled at the tableau they created, father and son, the same golden light catching in their hair, the same set to their shoulders. William was growing to be his father's son in more than just appearance, embodying Samuel's patience and thoughtfulness alongside the curiosity and occasional stubbornness he'd inherited from his mother. "Mama, look," Ellie called, breaking into Sarah's reverie. "I made a flower." Sarah shifted baby James to one arm and leaned forward to examine the arrangement of stones. "It's beautiful, sweetheart. What kind of flower is it?" "A special one," Ellie declared with the certainty of a 3-year-old, "for the fairies that live by the stream." Samuel caught Sarah's eye over their daughter's head, his smile reflecting her own amusement and tenderness. These moments, these ordinary, perfect moments, were the true measure of the life they'd built together. Later, after the children were asleep, William and Ellie in their shared room, and baby James in the cradle beside their bed, Samuel and Sarah sat on the porch in the gathering darkness. His arm was around her shoulders, her head resting against him in the comfortable position they'd perfected over years of such evenings. "Sheriff Mills mentioned they're finally getting a railroad spur to Linden," Samuel said, breaking the companionable silence. "Be here by next spring if all goes according to plan." "That'll change things," Sarah mused. "Make it easier to ship cattle, I suppose, and bring more people." Samuel's voice held a note of caution. "Town's already grown since we've been here," it was true. Linden had expanded in the past 5 years, with new businesses opening along the main street and houses sprouting where once there had been only open land. Progress, most called it, though Sarah sometimes missed the close-knit community they'd known in the early days. "Change isn't always bad," she said, though part of her shared his reservations. "The children will have more opportunities as they grow." Samuel nodded, his fingers absently tracing patterns on her arm. "Been thinking about that, about the future." "What about it?" "William's going to need proper schooling before long, more than we can give him here at home. And Ellie too, eventually." Sarah sighed, knowing he was right. They'd been teaching William his letters and numbers themselves, but there was only so much they could do while running the ranch. "The school in town is getting better. They hired a second teacher last year." "True," Samuel agreed, "but I was thinking we might consider building something closer to home." When Sarah looked at him questioningly, he continued, "This area's growing too. The Hendersons moved into that new place 3 miles east, and I heard the Johnson family bought land just north of us. There's at least a dozen children within riding distance now, enough to justify a small schoolhouse." Sarah sat up straighter, intrigued by the idea. "Where would we build it?" "That flat piece by the crossroads would be ideal, accessible to everyone in the area." His eyes took on the focused look she'd come to recognize when he was planning something. "I've got some savings set aside, could donate the land and help with the construction if other families contributed too." "A school," Sarah said thoughtfully, "our own little community school." The idea appealed to her deeply, not just for their children's education, but for what it represented, roots sinking deeper into this land, a legacy beyond the ranch itself. "What do you think?" Samuel asked, watching her face in the dim light from the window. Sarah leaned forward and kissed him, soft and lingering. "I think," she said when they parted, "that you, Samuel Zane, are still building things not just with wood and nails, but for our future." His smile was visible even in the darkness. "Our future. I like the sound of that." The school project began that autumn, after the harvest was in and before winter set in. As Samuel had predicted, other families in the area embraced the idea enthusiastically, contributing lumber, labor, and furnishings. By early December, the one-room schoolhouse stood complete at the crossroads, painted white with green shutters that Sarah had insisted upon to make it cheerful for the children. Finding a teacher proved more challenging than building the school, but fortune smiled upon them in the form of Miss Hannah Perkins, the niece of Dr. Perkins in Linden, who had teaching experience from back east and had come west to help her aging uncle with his practice. She agreed to teach during the winter months when the doctor's practice was slower, with the understanding that she might need to be called away for medical emergencies. The school opened in January 1882, with 15 students ranging in age from 6 to 14. William Zane, newly turned 7, was among the youngest, his excitement about real school tempered by nervousness about being away from home all day. "What if I don't know the answers?" he asked Sarah anxiously as she helped him dress for his first day. "Then you'll learn them," she replied, straightening his collar. "That's what school is for, sweetheart. No one expects you to know everything already." Samuel drove William to school that first morning in the wagon, with Sarah, Ellie, and baby James accompanying them despite the cold. As they approached the schoolhouse, they saw other families arriving, some on horseback, some in wagons similar to their own, all converging on the small building that already had smoke rising from its chimney. Miss Perkins stood at the door, welcoming each child with a warm smile. When William's turn came, he hesitated, looking back at his parents with sudden uncertainty. "Go on, son," Samuel encouraged gently. "We'll be back to get you this afternoon." William squared his small shoulders and stepped forward, accepting Miss Perkins's greeting with the politeness Sarah had instilled in him. As he disappeared into the schoolhouse, Sarah felt Samuel's arm slip around her waist. "He'll be fine," he murmured. "I know," she replied, blinking back unexpected tears. "It's just he's growing up so fast." Samuel nodded, his own expression a mixture of pride and that same wistful recognition of time's swift passage. "They all will." As they drove home, Ellie peppered them with questions about when she could go to school too, while James slept peacefully bundled against the winter chill. Sarah found herself thinking about the years ahead, William growing into a young man, Ellie following in his footsteps, baby James taking his first steps and speaking his first words. The future stretched before them, rich with possibilities. There would be challenges, certainly drought years and harsh winters, the inevitable conflicts as their children grew and developed their own wills. The changes that would come to Linden and the surrounding area as more settlers arrived and the railroad connected them more closely to the wider world. But facing those challenges together seemed not just possible but right. Their partnership, which had begun beside the charred remains of Sarah's first home, had been tested and strengthened through the years. What they had built together, not just the ranch and the home, but the family and the community around them, was sturdy enough to weather whatever storms might come. That night, after the children were asleep, Sarah found Samuel at the kitchen table, sketching plans for a new barn to replace the aging structure they'd been using since before the fire. "Always building something," she said fondly, setting a cup of coffee beside him. He looked up with a smile. "Someone once told me I had capable hands. Seems a shame not to use them." Sarah took those hands in hers, running her thumbs over the calluses earned through years of honest work. "Very capable," she agreed, her voice softening with memories of all the ways those hands had shaped their life together, from framing walls to cradling newborns, from mending fences to wiping away tears. Samuel set aside his pencil and drew her onto his lap, an intimacy that had become comfortable over their years together, but had lost none of its sweetness. "Happy?" he asked, an echo of the question he'd posed on their wedding day. Sarah rested her forehead against his, breathing in the familiar scent of him, wood smoke and soap, and the indefinable essence that was simply Samuel. "More than I ever thought possible," she answered truthfully. "You." His kiss was answer enough, but when they separated, he added, "I found everything I never knew I was looking for the day I rode up to that burned-out cabin and saw you standing there." Outside, the winter wind whistled around the eaves of the home they'd built from ashes. But inside was warmth and light, and the quiet certainty of belonging that they had created together. From the smallest seed of hope, "We'll build it again together," had grown this life, this love, this legacy that would endure long after the memory of that first cabin had faded into family lore. Later, as they lay together in the darkness of their bedroom, the steady breathing of baby James in his cradle a counterpoint to the occasional creak of the house settling, Sarah thought about the journey that had brought them here. From loss and devastation had come renewal and joy, proving that endings could indeed be beginnings in disguise. "What are you thinking about?" Samuel murmured, his voice drowsy in the darkness. Sarah curled closer to him, grateful for the solid warmth of his presence. "About how sometimes the worst day of your life can lead to the best years of your life, if you're brave enough to keep going." His arm tightened around her. "And if you're lucky enough to find the right partner for the journey." "Yes," she agreed, sleep beginning to claim her. "If you're lucky enough for that." As the years passed, the Zane ranch continued to prosper. The small schoolhouse at the crossroads grew to accommodate more students as families settled in the area, drawn by the fertile land and the growing community. William, Ellie, and James were joined by another sister, Grace, born in the summer of 1885, completing their family circle. By the turn of the century, Linden had transformed from the small frontier town Samuel and Sarah had known into a bustling community with a proper train station, a bank, and even a small hospital where Dr. Perkins trained a successor before finally retiring. The wilderness was gradually giving way to civilization, though the mountains remained eternal on the horizon, a reminder of the land's wild heart. Through it all, the cabin they had rebuilt together stood as a testament to what was possible when two people committed to building something that would last. It had been expanded, improved, and modernized over the decades, but at its core remained the structure they had raised with their own hands from the ashes of what had been lost. On a golden autumn afternoon in 1906, 30 years after Samuel had found Sarah standing beside the burned ruins of her first home, they sat together on the same porch where they had spent countless evenings. Their hair had silvered now, and the years had left their marks in the lines on their faces and the occasional stiffness in their joints. But their eyes, when they looked at each other, held the same warmth and understanding that had grown between them through decades of shared joys and sorrows. Their children were grown and starting families of their own. William ran the ranch now, with his wife Mary and their 3 children living in a house he'd built on the eastern section of the property. Ellie had married the town's young doctor and lived in Linden, though she visited often with her twins. James had gone east to university and returned as the local schoolmaster, living in the small house attached to what was now a proper 3-room schoolhouse. And Grace, their youngest, had recently married a rancher from the next county, bringing together 2 of the area's most prosperous families. "Remember when all this was just wilderness?" Samuel asked, his hand covering Sarah's on the arm of her chair. "When we could ride for hours and not see another soul," Sarah nodded, her mind drifting back through the years to those early days. "Everything changes," she said softly. "Everything except what matters most." Samuel's fingers tightened around hers. "What matters most?" She turned to him, this man who had been her partner through 3 decades of building a life together, and smiled. "Love, family, the promises we keep to each other through good times and bad." As the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, they sat in companionable silence. 2 people who had learned that the greatest adventures were not always those that took you far from home, but sometimes those that led you back to it. From the ashes of a burned cabin, they had built not just a house, but a legacy, one of love, perseverance, and the quiet courage it takes to begin again when life burns down around you. Their story, which had begun with loss and a simple offer of help, had become one of the enduring tales of Linden, passed down through generations as an example of what it meant to face adversity with grace and to build something lasting from the ruins. And it had all started with those 5 words spoken by a cowboy to a woman who thought she had lost everything. "We'll build it again together." Words that had been not just a promise, but a prophecy of a home rebuilt, a love discovered, a family created, and a life shared in all its beautiful complexity. A promise kept through all the years that followed until the very end.